It began in the late 17th century, a time of chaos, revolutions, and collapsing kingdoms. Europe was burning, monarchs were constantly at war, their treasuries empty, their people exhausted. But out of this chaos, Britain made a discovery that would redefine global power for centuries. War could be profitable. For centuries, kings had financed wars by draining their gold reserves, seizing church property, or taxing peasants into starvation. War was a desperate gamble that often ended in bankruptcy. But in 1694, Britain changed the rules forever. It created something new: the Bank of England. Unlike any institution before it, the Bank of England was built not just to store money, but to create it. It allowed the government to borrow vast sums from private investors, issuing bonds backed by the crown itself. In other words, war could now be financed by debt, not treasure. And this changed everything. Instead of paying soldiers with dwindling gold, Britain could now issue government bonds, promises to pay interest later, and raise millions almost overnight. Those bonds were bought by merchants, landowners, and bankers across the country who realized something extraordinary. They could profit from war without ever fighting it. The more Britain fought, the more bonds were issued. And the more bonds were issued, the richer the investors became. War was no longer a drain on the nation, it was an opportunity. By the early 1700s, Britain had perfected this system. While France and Spain were still relying on outdated methods of plunder and taxation, Britain's wars were powered by investors, accountants, and clerks. For the first time in history, a nation's firepower was directly linked to its financial markets. Every cannonball fired, every ship built, every soldier sent abroad was funded by credit. And that credit was controlled by the City of London, a small square mile that would soon become the beating financial heart of the modern world. The War of Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution. Each of these conflicts cost Britain staggering sums. Yet each one made the empire even stronger, because while its national debt ballooned, so did its global reach. Britain's debt in 1700 was around $14 million. By 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it had exploded to over 850 million, more than 15 times higher. But unlike other nations, this debt didn't destroy Britain. It made it dominant. Why? Because Britain's debt was trusted. Investors believed the British government would always pay them back, with interest. So money flowed into London from across Europe. Foreign investors, even enemies of the crown, bought British bonds. They were effectively funding Britain's wars against themselves. This was the genius of Britain's new financial system. It turned loyalty, patriotism, and even enmity into sources of revenue. And while soldiers fought and died across continents, the investors back home collected interest payments from the treasury, secure in the knowledge that victory would make their fortunes even greater. The Industrial Revolution only amplified this power. As Britain's factories mass-produced weapons, textiles, and ships, its financial institutions mass-produced credit. The economy was now fully integrated into the machinery of war. Banks financed the iron foundries that built cannons. Merchants insured the ships that carried troops. Manufacturers supplied armies across the globe. War had become Britain's most profitable export. The results were staggering. Each victory expanded not just Britain's territory, but its trade routes, its naval dominance, and most importantly, its access to resources. India's cotton, the Caribbean's sugar, Africa's gold, China's tea, all flowed through British hands, feeding both its economy and its wars. Even when Britain lost, it won. The American Revolution, for example, was a political defeat, but an economic victory. Within years, the newly independent United States became one of Britain's largest trading partners, financed through London banks. Britain had learned the ultimate lesson of empire, that financial control was more powerful than military conquest. You didn't need to own a country to profit from it. You just needed to control its credit. By the time Napoleon rose to power, Britain's war finance machine was unstoppable. The Bank of England printed money, Parliament issued bonds, and the Royal Navy protected trade routes. Britain could spend more, fight longer, and survived disasters that would bankrupt any other empire. And when Napoleon finally fell at Waterloo in 1815, Britain emerged as not just the victor, but the banker of Europe. It had financed its allies, supplied its armies, insured its fleets, and taxed its colonies. And every step of the way, the profits came back home. The wars that destroyed other empires had built Britain's. Debt was no longer a weakness, it was a weapon. And London had become the arsenal. But the story doesn't end there. Because once Britain realized it could finance its own wars indefinitely, it made an even darker discovery. It didn't have to stop there. If war itself could be profitable, why not everyone's war? What if I told you that every major war in modern history, from Napoleon to World War II, helped make Britain richer? That while other nations bled, Britain banked. This is the untold story of how the British Empire built its wealth not just through conquest, but through conflict itself, turning every war into an investment. Because behind every battlefield there was a balance sheet, and behind every victory there was a ledger full of profit. For centuries, Britain discovered what few nations ever mastered: how to weaponize finance, how to turn chaos into opportunity, and how to build an empire not just on land, but on loans. While empires rose and fell on the sword, Britain rose on the spreadsheet. In an age when kings fought for glory, Britain fought for revenue. Every cannon fired, every ship launched, every battle waged, all had a number attached. And when the smoke cleared, Britain's bankers counted not the dead, but the dividends. This was the genius of British power. They didn't just conquer nations, they monetized them. Wars became investments, colonies became markets, and the world itself became collateral. The empire was never just about territory, it was about cash flow. While France burned through its treasury under Napoleon, and Spain exhausted its gold from the Americas, Britain created something far more powerful than raw resources. It built a system that could outlast kings, revolutions, and even the empire itself. A system that turned national debt into global domination. From the moment the Bank of England was founded in 1694, Britain discovered a secret formula: the ability to fund wars without ever going broke. It was revolutionary, an empire financed not by treasure, but by credit, by convincing its own people, and even foreigners, to invest in its conflicts. Britain could fight longer, harder, and smarter than anyone else. But it didn't stop there. Once Britain learned how to profit from its own wars, it learned how to profit from everyone else's. The same ships that carried soldiers also carried goods, loans, and weapons, sold to friend and foe alike. And every war, whether fought in Europe, Africa, or Asia, fed the same heart: the City of London. This wasn't war for survival, it was war as business, and the profits were extraordinary. What began as a small island kingdom, fighting for survival against continental giants, soon became the world's richest empire, financed by perpetual conflict. By the 19th century, Britain wasn't just fighting wars, it was managing them, financing them, profiting from them. Because in the empire's grand design, war wasn't a tragedy, it was a transaction. And as history would prove again and again, when the world went to war, Britain went to the bank. If Britain could profit from its own wars, what stopped it from profiting from everyone else's? Nothing. And that's exactly what it did. By the 19th century, the City of London had evolved into something far more powerful than a national institution. It was now an international financial hub, the nerve center of global war capitalism. While Britain's armies conquered on land, its bankers conquered on paper. The city's financial elite realized that neutrality, or at least the illusion of it, was the perfect disguise for profit. Britain could publicly take a side in any war, but privately, its banks could do business with both sides. This wasn't treason, it was economics. The Napoleonic Wars provided the perfect example. The Rothschild family, a dynasty of bankers with branches in London, Paris, Frankfurt, and Vienna, built an empire on war. While Britain and France clashed across Europe, Rothschild couriers moved between battlefields and capitals faster than any government messenger. They traded information, and information in war was money. Nathan Rothschild in London famously learned of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo before the British government did. He used that knowledge to manipulate bond markets, buying and selling government debt at lightning speed. When the news finally broke to the public, he had already made a fortune. It wasn't just the Rothschilds. British merchants supplied uniforms, weapons, and food, not only to their own troops, but to foreign armies as well. In an era when wars destroyed industries in Europe, British factories stayed busy. Production surged, profits soared, and exports exploded. War became the greatest economic stimulus Britain could ever ask for. During the Crimean War, 1853-1856, British arms manufacturers sold rifles and cannons to allies and clients alike. During the Boer Wars in South Africa, British investors poured money into mining companies that profited directly from the chaos they helped create. Even in wars where Britain wasn't directly involved, like the American Civil War, its industries supplied weapons, textiles, and ships to both the Union and the Confederacy. The rule was simple. Conflict meant contracts, and contracts meant capital. But the profits weren't limited to weapons. The entire British economy became a war ecosystem. Insurance firms like Lloyd's of London insured merchant ships carrying supplies through war zones, charging enormous premiums that skyrocketed with every new risk. Banks offered loans to governments desperate for cash. Investors traded in war bonds and speculated on victories and defeats like gamblers at a table. To the financiers of London, every explosion overseas was an opportunity to make money. Even peace was just another investment window. When wars ended, reconstruction began, and British banks were the first to offer credit to rebuild what war had destroyed. They lent to allies, to former enemies, even to colonies that had revolted. Because in the end, everyone owed London. This was more than just clever business. It was a transformation of morality itself. War was no longer viewed as a failure of diplomacy. It was a market event. Each declaration of war triggered waves of speculation. Each treaty was analyzed for its financial yield. Newspapers didn't just report battle outcomes. They reported bond prices. By the late 1800s, the British arms industry had become one of the most profitable sectors in the world. Companies like Vickers, Armstrong Whitworth, and BSA, Birmingham Small Arms, expanded their factories, supplying artillery and ships to any nation that could pay, including those that might one day use those same weapons against Britain. The hypocrisy didn't matter. The profits did. And when the First World War erupted in 1914, the system reached its peak. Britain entered the war as the world's largest creditor. It left it deeply indebted to the United States, but its private financial institutions emerged richer and more globally entrenched than ever before. Factories ran day and night producing ammunition. Insurance premiums hit record highs. London banks handled the flow of billions in international loans. Even the government's war borrowing became a lucrative trade on the bond market. Ordinary citizens invested their savings into war bonds, believing they were serving their country, not realizing they were fueling an engine of debt that enriched the few and indebted the many. For the financial elite, it was perfect. War created debt. Debt created dependency, and dependency guaranteed future profit. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the world was shattered, but the City of London stood stronger than ever. Even in destruction, Britain profited, and that became the template for the next century. Whenever conflict erupted, in Europe, Africa, or the Middle East, British banks, insurers, and manufacturers were there first, financing, insuring, trading, and investing. War wasn't just a national endeavor anymore. It was a global industry, and London was its headquarters. Through this system, Britain discovered a brutal truth. That blood was the most reliable commodity on earth. But there was an even more powerful realization waiting ahead, one that would take the empire beyond the battlefield. Britain would soon learn that it didn't even need to fight wars to profit from them. It could simply lend money to those who did. And that revelation gave birth to something even more insidious: the empire of debt. Britain no longer needed to fight wars to expand its empire. It could simply lend money. And when the borrower failed to pay, take control. This was the new form of conquest, a quiet empire built not on bayonets and battleships, but on contracts, interest rates, and unpaid debts. After the Napoleonic Wars, Britain emerged as the world's financial superpower. The Royal Navy ruled the seas, but it was the City of London that ruled the world's balance sheets. Every ship that sailed, every loan issued, every ounce of gold traded, it all flowed through London's banks. The Industrial Revolution had turned Britain into the workshop of the world, but finance made it the creditor of the world. Instead of colonizing nations through armies, Britain began colonizing them through debt. It started with small loans to struggling monarchies and young republics in Latin America. Countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico borrowed millions from British investors in the 1820s to fund railways, ports, and armies. But when the markets crashed, as they inevitably did, they couldn't pay. And when they couldn't pay, Britain didn't forgive. It intervened. British diplomats stepped in to protect investors, forcing debtor nations to hand over control of customs revenues, trade routes, and infrastructure. In some cases, Britain even stationed gunboats offshore, a tactic so common it earned a name: gunboat diplomacy. It was conquest by accounting, and it worked. In Egypt, for example, British investors had poured money into the Suez Canal, one of the most strategically valuable waterways in the world. When Egypt couldn't meet its debt obligations in the 1870s, Britain stepped in, took control of its finances, and eventually occupied the country outright, all without declaring war. The pattern repeated across the empire. Debt became the new flag. Behind it all stood the East India Company, the ultimate example of private finance fused with imperial ambition. Founded as a trading venture, it evolved into a corporate superpower. With its own army, navy, and legal system, the company didn't just trade goods. It waged private wars, minted its own currency, and governed over 300 million people. Its profits were astronomical. Textiles, spices, opium, tea, all extracted from conquered lands and sold back to Europe at enormous margins. The wealth poured into London, fueling banks, insuring ships, and underwriting new loans for the next round of expansion. India's wealth became Britain's war chest. Taxes collected from Indian peasants financed Britain's global campaigns, from suppressing revolts in Africa to funding naval dominance in Asia. By the 19th century, India wasn't just a colony. It was the empire's balance sheet. But the genius and the cruelty of this system was that it disguised control as commerce. Colonies were told they were being modernized. Railroads, ports, telegraphs, all built with British loans and British engineers. But those same loans came with impossible interest rates. And when payment deadlines arrived, the collateral was sovereignty itself. It was an empire that didn't need to fire a shot. In places like the Caribbean, debt replaced chains. After the abolition of slavery, Britain compensated slave owners, not the enslaved, paying them with interest-bearing bonds that enriched the British elite for generations. The colonies remained trapped in a cycle of dependence, forced to borrow again just to survive in the system that Britain had created. Even beyond the colonies, Britain's financial grip was everywhere. South American republics, Ottoman provinces, African kingdoms all became debtors to London. British banks financed their armies, British companies managed their resources, and British courts enforced their contracts. This was financial imperialism, invisible, efficient, and nearly impossible to resist. By the late 1800s, the empire's reach extended far beyond its borders. It wasn't the red stains on the world map that told the real story. It was the numbers in the ledgers of the city. Every pound loaned came with strings attached. Every debt crisis created an opportunity, and every opportunity deepened Britain's control. Even as other European powers scrambled for colonies in Africa, Britain played a different game. While France and Germany fought for land, Britain financed both sides, ensured the shipping routes, and dominated global trade in the background. It was empire without the burden of empire, profits without the cost of governance. By the dawn of the 20th century, nearly half of the world's international lending flowed through London. Entire economies operated in sterling, meaning they depended on Britain's banks to settle trade. From Argentina's railways to China's ports, the British pound became the invisible chain that bound the world to London's financial system. And it was all built on one truth: debt is more permanent than conquest. Armies withdraw, flags fall, but debt endures. Britain had created a system where nations could never truly be free, because freedom required repayment, and repayment required compliance. And so, even as Britain's empire appeared stable, its foundations were shifting. A new kind of war was approaching, one that would shake the old world to its core. When the guns of August 1914 erupted across Europe, Britain's empire of debt was about to collide with the bloodiest conflict in human history. A war so vast, so devastating, that it would redraw borders, topple empires, and rewrite the rules of global finance once again. But when it was over, one thing would remain the same: Britain would still find a way to profit. When the First World War began in 1914, Britain was at the height of its global influence. It controlled the seas, managed the world's currency, and financed half the planet's trade. But war would test the empire's power, and prove once again that even in destruction, Britain could profit. At first, the numbers were staggering. Britain spent nearly $9 million a day on the war, a sum unimaginable at the time. Millions of men were mobilized, factories were converted to produce ammunition, and the treasury began borrowing at record speed. But the question was, where would the money come from? The answer was the same as it had been for centuries: the City of London. The government issued war bonds, and investors lined up to buy them. Patriotism mixed with profit. Posters promised citizens they were helping their country. In truth, they were buying into one of the most profitable financial products in British history. Every bomb dropped over the trenches of France generated interest payments back home. Every factory order, every ship built, every uniform sewn, all created dividends for those who held the right bonds, stocks, and contracts. It was war on the ground, but business in the city. Yet Britain's vast empire meant that the costs of war were never truly its own. Troops, taxes, and raw materials came from across the colonies: India, Australia, Canada, Africa. Over 2.5 million Indian soldiers fought for the empire. The colonies paid with both blood and resources, while the profits were calculated in London. By the end of the war, Britain owed the United States over $1 billion, an astronomical sum at the time. But that debt didn't weaken its financial system. It globalized it. Because in managing war finance, Britain had also helped reshape global capitalism. The pound sterling remained the world's reserve currency. Global trade still cleared through London banks. And when peace finally came in 1918, the City of London was ready for reconstruction. Another lucrative phase in the war economy. British financiers organized loans for rebuilding Europe, insuring cargo, and reconstructing industries devastated by war. They financed Germany's reparation payments, French reconstruction, and even US investments in Europe. Once again, Britain was not just surviving the war. It was managing it, profiting from the chaos it helped contain. But beneath the surface, the world was changing. The United States had become the new industrial and financial powerhouse. And while Britain still commanded enormous influence, the empire's finances were overstretched. The cost of maintaining its global network, military, trade, colonial administration, was rising faster than its profits. So the empire did what it always did best. It innovated in finance. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, Britain no longer had the same industrial edge, but it had an unparalleled financial infrastructure. Once again, it issued bonds, borrowed billions, and mobilized the Commonwealth for war. But this time, the financial center of gravity began to shift, from London to New York. The war drained Britain's gold reserves and forced it to rely heavily on US loans and Lend-Lease agreements. For the first time in modern history, Britain became a debtor instead of the lender. Yet even in this apparent decline, Britain's financial elite adapted. They understood that while the empire's political control might crumble, financial control could still endure. As Europe burned, British banks laid the groundwork for the post-war economy, one built on international finance rather than imperial rule. And when the war ended in 1945, they helped shape the new monetary order. At Bretton Woods, Britain may have officially ceded dominance of the global currency system to the US dollar, but it carved out a niche for itself that would become even more powerful in the decades to come: offshore finance. London's bankers realized that even if the pound was no longer the global reserve currency, the city could remain the world's financial hub by handling other nations' money. They began building networks of offshore territories, remnants of the empire, where money could move freely, beyond the reach of foreign regulation and taxation. It was the birth of the Eurodollar market, a new system where US dollars could be deposited in London banks and lent out globally, outside American control. The British government didn't regulate it. The Americans couldn't stop it. And soon, billions began flowing through this shadow system. Britain had found a way to remain at the center of global finance, without needing an empire at all. While the world rebuilt from war, London quietly reinvented itself. The city became a magnet for money, legal and illegal, national and offshore, clean and dirty. Corporations, oil sheikhs, and politicians alike trusted London's bankers to handle their wealth discreetly. The same old formula: war, chaos, and opportunity was still at work. Only now, the wars were financial. The world wars had taught Britain one final lesson: that political empires fall, but financial ones endure. The red lines on the map had faded, but the networks of trade, banking, and debt that Britain had built still spanned the globe. Through its institutions, the Bank of England, Lloyd's, and the City of London Corporation, Britain continued to profit from global conflict long after the guns had gone silent. Insurance on war shipments, financing for reconstruction, weapons trade deals, all routed through London. The empire no longer marched. It negotiated, it financed, it insured. And while the world believed Britain's empire had died in 1945, the truth was far more remarkable. It had simply changed its uniform. The soldiers were gone, but the bankers remained. The colonies had independence, but their economies still depended on British capital. And the pound, though weaker, still whispered through the corridors of global finance. The empire had found a new battlefield, the balance sheet. And in the decades that followed, Britain would prove that the end of empire was not the end of dominance. Because the world has money, and the shadow systems that moved it still flowed through the city of London. By the 1960s, the British Empire had officially ended. The colonies had raised their flags, declared independence, and written their own constitutions. But beneath the political theatre, something deeper and more enduring remained. Britain had lost its empire, yes, but it had quietly constructed something far more powerful. A financial empire without borders. The City of London, that tiny square mile of glass, stone, and quiet power, became the new heart of global capitalism. It no longer ruled over colonies with armies. It ruled over nations with accounts. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a deliberate reinvention, a masterclass in survival. When the old empire began to crumble after World War II, Britain's elite faced an existential crisis. The pound was weak. Manufacturing was fading. The colonies were slipping away. But the financiers of London saw opportunity in decline. If the empire's wealth could no longer come from territories, it would come from transactions. The solution was offshore finance. Using remnants of the old empire, island territories scattered across the Caribbean, the Channel, and the Indian Ocean, Britain built a vast network of tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions. Places like the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Jersey, Guernsey, and the British Virgin Islands became outposts of invisible finance. Officially, they were self-governing. In reality, they operated under British legal systems, British banks, and British protection. And together they formed the backbone of a new empire, the shadow empire of money. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Money could move through these territories without taxation, scrutiny, or regulation. Corporations could hide profits. dictators could stash fortunes. And all of it, every transfer, every deposit, was managed through London. By the 1970s, the Eurodollar market had exploded. Trillions of US dollars flowed through British-controlled banks that technically weren't in Britain. The system was outside the jurisdiction of both Washington and Westminster, yet served both perfectly. It was untraceable, untouchable, and immensely profitable. This was the new version of imperial trade. Instead of goods, Britain exported financial secrecy. Just as the East India Company once dominated the seas, the City of London now dominated invisible oceans of capital. It didn't matter who ruled politically, money always came home to London. By the 1980s, under Margaret Thatcher, the city's transformation accelerated. Deregulation removed barriers between traditional banks, investment firms, and foreign capital. The Big Bang of 1986 unleashed a tidal wave of global finance. Foreign banks flooded into London. New derivatives markets were created. Computerized trading took over the trading floors. In just a decade, the City of London went from a national institution to the world's financial nerve center. Wall Street had the headlines, but London had the control. And its reach was extraordinary. Over 90% of global tax havens today can be traced back to Britain's colonial legacy. Every offshore network, every secrecy jurisdiction, every shell company, linked directly or indirectly to London's laws and lawyers. The empire had gone underground, but its arteries were everywhere. It no longer needed governors or garrisons. It had accountants, bankers, and lawyers. The profits were cleaner, the risks smaller, and the moral questions easier to ignore. Where once soldiers looted gold from palaces, now money moved digitally from one offshore account to another, silently, efficiently, invisibly. Britain's wealth was no longer measured in colonies, but in compliance. How many corporations parked their earnings under British protection? How many governments borrowed from British institutions? How many billionaires hid their assets through British-linked shell companies? By the dawn of the 21st century, the numbers were staggering. It is estimated that half of all offshore wealth in the world is hidden in jurisdictions connected to Britain. And at the center of it all, the same old square mile, the City of London. The city became the world's safe haven for capital of every kind, clean or corrupt, legal or illicit. Russian oligarchs bought mansions in Kensington. African dictators' fortunes flowed through London law firms. American corporations used British territories to avoid taxes. Once again, Britain had turned global disorder into an export. Where there was instability, London offered security. Where there was risk, it offered insurance. Where there were sanctions, it offered loopholes. And just like in the old empire, every transaction fed back into the British economy, quietly sustaining its banks, its property markets, and its global influence. It was empire by other means, an empire without an army, but with a network. Even today, this system remains the invisible skeleton of the global economy, a hidden structure built on centuries of British law, trust, and secrecy. It allows trillions of dollars to move across borders beyond democratic oversight. For many countries, it's both a blessing and a curse, a source of capital, but also a drain of wealth. Because while the empire's flags no longer fly, its shadow still darkens every balance sheet it ever touched. From Victorian gunboats to modern spreadsheets, Britain has mastered the art of reinvention. It transformed slavery into trade, trade into finance, finance into offshore power. And through it all, one thing never changed: the ability to turn global turmoil into national profit. The City of London is not just a financial district. It's the final form of an empire that learned to live forever. But if the city is the empire's heart, what remains of its soul? Because behind every statistic, every fortune, every offshore account, there lies a question that echoes through history. Was it ever really about freedom, or was it always about profit? The flags may have been lowered, the colonies long gone, but Britain's system of wealth extraction still hums quietly beneath the surface of the global economy, invisible, efficient, and unstoppable. An empire that conquered the world, and then conquered time itself. For centuries, Britain discovered what few nations truly understood, that war and wealth are connected. From the battlefields of Europe to the boardrooms of London, the empire learned that every crisis, every conflict, every collapse could be turned into currency. While others fought for survival, Britain fought for stability and profit. It built a system so enduring, so adaptable, that it outlived kings, revolutions, and even the empire itself. Because the real empire was never about land or flags. It was about leverage. From muskets to markets, from gunboats to global banking, Britain mastered the art of control without conquest. It ruled through trade, dominated through debt, and survived through finance. And even when the empire fell, its network remained, embedded in the world's financial architecture. Invisible, but omnipresent. Today, the same structures that once financed colonial wars now finance global corporations. The same offshore networks that once extracted wealth from colonies now shelter it from taxation. The same financial centers that once served kings now serve the world's elite. History didn't end. It evolved. The red lines on the map may have faded, but the lines of credit endure. Britain no longer sends armies to foreign shores, but its laws, banks, and accountants still shape the global economy. The empire learned to live without borders, to profit without presence. It became what it always wanted to be, eternal. And that's the paradox of history. Empires fall, but systems survive. The world believes the British Empire died in the 20th century, but in truth, it was reborn in another form. Cleaner, quieter, more sophisticated. Not an empire of colonies, but an empire of capital. So the next time you see the skyline of London, those towers of glass standing where cannons once guarded the Thames, remember this. You're not looking at a city, you're looking at the headquarters of the longest running business model in human history. An empire that turned war into wealth and conflict into currency. And as long as there are wars to fight, debts to pay, and money to move, that empire will never truly die. Because empires don't disappear. They rebrand. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of history, the untold financial stories behind the world's greatest empires, make sure to subscribe to Financial Tales. Join our community of thinkers, historians, and investors, uncovering how power, money, and history intertwine. Because to understand the future of finance, you must first understand the business of the past. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more episodes that expose how empires, old and new, still profit from the world's chaos. This is Financial Tales, where history meets money and truth meets profit.